You ever have one of those neighbors who seems to wake up in the morning just to ruin your peace? Well, I thought living by a quiet, glassy blue lake meant escaping all that drama, till Karen decided my garage door was a threat to the neighborhood. She didn't just gossip, she called 911. What happened next turned our calm lakeside into the stage for the funniest, pettiest, and most satisfying revenge I've ever pulled off. Asterisk mornings by the lake are usually my favorite mist, curling. Off the water, ducks paddling lazily by, and the distant hum of fishing boats. I'd sit on my porch, sip my coffee, and thank the universe for giving me a life far from chaos. But as I soon learned, chaos has a way of rowing right up to your dockers, especially when it's wearing oversized sunglasses, clutching an HOA pamphlet, and going by the name Karen. Asterisk, before we get into this crazy story, drop a comment below and tell me from which part of the world are you watching. I love seeing how far our little lakeside tales travel. Asterisk, there's a certain kind of quiet you only get by the water. Not the dead, eerie quiet you find in the middle of nowhere, but the living kinda hum of life carried on the breeze. That morning was exactly that kind of quiet. The sun had just begun its slow climb over the far shore, sending golden streaks across the lake until the ripples looked like they were plated in gold leaf. The air was still cool, carrying the faint scent of damp pine and freshly cut grass. Somewhere in the distance, a loon let out its mournful call, echoing over the water like a song from another time. It was the kind of morning that made you want to slow down time. I sat with my coffee, watching the mist hover low over the surface, before curling away in the sun. My boat was tied up gently against the dock, bobbing with the smallest of waves. Across the lake, a fisherman had staked his claim to the morning, barely moving except for the slow rhythm of his cast. This was why I had moved here, to trade the noise of the city for this untouched stillness. Behind me, my home stood quiet and solid. A modest lakeside cabin that had been expanded over the years into something more comfortable but still unpretentious. I kept the place clean, the lawn trimmed, the dock in good repair. My garage sat on the side facing the road, a plain white door that had weathered a few seasons but still worked perfectly. There was nothing remarkable about it, and that was exactly how I liked it. No eyesores, no gaudy displays, just a home that fit into the scenery. But peace never lasts. Not when you've got neighbors who can't leave well enough alone. It started small. The kind of thing you wouldn't even notice if you weren't paying attention. A faint crunch of gravel from the driveway behind me. The slow, deliberate sound of someone approaching, not in a friendly, casual way, but with that pointed heaviness people use when they want their presence known. The birds quieted for a moment, as if even they sensed the disruption. The air, which moments ago had been cool and open, suddenly felt tight. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Karen, she had a way of inserting herself into the landscape like a stain bright enough to pull focus, but not in a way you'd ever call pleasant. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed guardian of community standards in our lakeside development. And while some might have been content with sending a polite letter or two, Karen thrived on confrontation, on showing up where she wasn't wanted, and on making herself the star of problems that didn't exist. I could feel her eyes sweeping over the side of my house, pausing, lingering on the garage door. That plain white door, the same one I'd had for years, was suddenly the most interesting thing in her world. There's a certain tension you can feel even without words. A kind of unspoken charge that crackles in the air when someone is silently judging you. I stayed still, eyes fixed on the water, but my attention was no longer on the shimmer of the sunlit ripples. I could feel her pacing just out of my line of sight, like a crow circling something shiny. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of lake water mixed with the faint chemical temps of sunscreen. I thought about the dozens of mornings I'd spent in that same spot. Undisturbed, my biggest worry being whether the coffee would stay hot long enough to enjoy. But this was different. The peace had fractured, and in its place was the unmistakable presence of trouble brewing. Behind me, gravel crunched again. The pace was sharper now, purposeful. She was leaving, but only for the moment. I'd seen that kind of retreat before. It was the same way a storm cloud will slip behind the hills, pretending to pass, only to roll back in later with twice the force. The lake, oblivious to human pettiness, carried on with its rhythm. Ducks skimmed the surface in a neat line. Somewhere, on the far shore, someone started up a lawnmower. The low hum breaking the quiet, but in a way that felt natural, unthreatening. Everything about the scene said normal.com. Safe except for the lingering weight of her presence. The thing about living in a small lakeside community is that your neighbors know far more about your life than you'd like. People notice when you change the color of your shutters, when you skip mowing the lawn for a week, when your boat's missing from the dock for too long. And Karen, she didn't just notice, she took mental notes, stored them away like ammunition, and pulled them out when she felt the need to assert control. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this morning was the beginning of a larger storm. There was no immediate confrontation, no raised voices or pointed accusations, just that look, that scrutiny, and her abrupt departure. And somehow, that felt worse than if she'd just said whatever was on her mind. The water glittered, and the air began to warm as the sun climbed higher. But my mood had shifted. What had started as a slow, golden morning now carried an undercurrent of unease. I knew Karen well enough to know that she didn't just drop something when she thought it was suspicious. No, she chewed on it, turned it over in her mind, convinced herself it was a bigger problem than it really was, and then went after it with everything she had. That garage door plane, harmless, unremarkable, wasn't going to stay that way. In her eyes, by the time I finished my coffee, I could already feel the edges of my day tightening. Somewhere across town, she was probably making a phone call, or jotting down notes, or digging through some HOA handbook, looking for a clause she could twist into an excuse. The stillness of the lake was almost mocking in how calm it remained, as if it were daring me to think everything would blow over. But, I knew better. Peace doesn't get taken in one sudden motion. It's chipped away, bit by bit, until you look around one day and realize it's gone. And as the wind picked up, rustling the reeds along the shore, I knew this morning had been the first chip. Whatever was coming next, it wouldn't be long before I found out. It didn't take long for the morning's uneasy quiet to give way to something heavier. The stillness of the lake remained, but for me, it was like someone had wound a clock spring too tight inside my chest. By mid-morning, the sun had warmed the air enough to carry the smells of lake, mud, and pine sap, mixing with the faint sweetness of wildflowers growing along the gravel road. That was when I saw her again. Karen had a way of making her presence known without saying a word. She came down the road like she was inspecting a crime scene, her steps sharp, her eyes locked on my house from the moment she came into view. There was a stiffness to her shoulders, a purposeful clip to her pace, and even from a distance, I could tell she'd made up her mind about something. I was in my driveway, tending to a row of potted geraniums that lined the edge near the garage. My garage door, still the same plain white, still completely unremarkable, stood closed behind me. The sun was hitting it just right, casting the faint shadows of the overhead pine branches across its surface, making it look almost picturesque. To any reasonable person, it would have blended into the scene. But Karen wasn't reasonable. She slowed as she reached the end of my driveway, her gaze fixed like she was staring at a wild animal she was about to trap. There was no friendliness in her posture, no neighborly wave, just that piercing focus. And then, without breaking stride, she reached into her oversized handbag, pulled out her phone and turned slightly away. I couldn't hear her voice from where I stood, but her posture told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't making a casual call. This was official. Her movements were precise, her stance firm. And every so often, she would tilt her head toward the garage door, as if she were describing some unspeakable crime in progress. It was almost surreal. Watching her frame my garage door, my harmless, plain white garage doors, the centerpiece of whatever she was reporting. She gestured toward it with a slow sweep of her arm, then pointed sharply, like it was evidence in a trial. Somewhere inside me, this simmer started. It wasn't just the call, it was the audacity, the way she stood there, using the same authority you might expect from someone reporting a house fire or a burglary. But for a garage door that had done absolutely nothing except exist in her line of sight. She didn't look at me once. It was as if I wasn't even there, just the supposed scene of the crime she was so intent on documenting. The lake, meanwhile, carried on in its own detached rhythm. A small fishing boat puttered past, its wake curling toward the dock. The smell of grilled fish wafted from a cottage down the shore. Sunlight danced across the water in restless patterns, and the cries of gulls echoed faintly over the breeze. All of it should have been calming, but the sight of her standing there, summoning the weight of law enforcement over nothing, was enough to make my jaw tighten. I turned back to my plants, pretending to fuss with the soil, but my attention stayed locked on her. She stood there for several minutes, pacing a small circle at the road's edge, her phone pressed to her ear. Her free hand moved constantly, pointing, slicing the air, tracing imaginary lines as she described whatever suspicious nonsense she'd invented. Finally, she ended the call and walked away, her posture triumphant, as if she'd just completed a great act of civic duty. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. The message was clear. Her wheels were already in motion. I stayed in the driveway a while longer, letting the quiet creep back in, though it didn't feel the same. That morning calm I'd started the day with had been replaced by a strange, watchful tension. The kind that comes when you know something's coming, even if you can't see it yet. And sure enough, about 20 minutes later, the sound of tires on gravel broke the stillness. It wasn't the gentle crunch of a neighbor's car, it was heavier, slower, deliberate. A vehicle built for authority, not for comfort. When the patrol car rounded the bend, its black and white frame stark against the green of the trees and the blue of the lake, I felt that knot in my chest tighten. It rolled up the road at a measured pace, sunlight flashing off the windshield, and came to a stop right in front of my driveway. 2 officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp, their faces set in the neutral mask of official business. Their eyes scanned the property, not the lake, not the flowers, not the dock, but the garage door. I stood still, letting them look, the absurdity of it all pressing down like a weight. Here I was, in one of the most peaceful places I'd ever known. And somehow my morning had turned into the kind of scene you'd expect from some suburban soap opera. The officers moved methodically, their eyes tracing every panel, every seam of the garage. They walked slowly along its length, even leaning down at one point to get a closer look, like they were examining some rare and dangerous artifact. The more they studied it, the more surreal it became. Around us, the lake carried on boats moving lazily, sunlight flashing, a warm breeze weaving through the scent of pine. But here, on this little patch of gravel and grass, the world had shifted into something ridiculous. I could feel the attention of other neighbors, too. A figure appeared in the window of a house 2 doors down. Another paused on their porch, mug in hand. Word traveled fast here, and a patrol car in front of a home was a sight that drew quiet curiosity. Karen had ensured it would be seen. When the officers finally turned away from the garage, their expressions were unreadable. The way people look when they've realized the call they responded to wasn't quite what they were expecting. They Didn't stay long there, wasn't much to do, after all. But that didn't matter to Karen. She'd gotten what she wanted. The spectacle as the patrol car rolled away. Kicking up a faint trail of dust, the weight of it all settled over me. The invasion wasn't in the form of a broken lock or vandalized property, was in the erosion of trust. The deliberate twisting of normal life into suspicion. Karen had planted the seed, and she'd done it in a way that made it public. The lake glittered in the afternoon sun, and yet, standing there, I felt the first real crack in the peace I'd worked so hard to protect. It wasn't just about a garage door anymore. It was about control, about humiliation, about someone deciding that their opinion was enough to turn your home into a target. And as I stood there, the breeze shifting off the water, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. There's a strange kind of quiet that comes after an intrusion, not the same as the peaceful silence I'd enjoyed that morning by the lake. This was different. This quiet had weight to it, a heaviness that pressed down on the air, the way a thunderstorm makes the world feel smaller before it breaks. The patrol car had pulled away, its taillights fading around the bend, but the echo of its presence still lingered in my driveway. The faint indentations of its tires were left behind in the gravel, and for a while, found myself staring at them like they were some kind of mark on my home's record. Inside, everything looked the same. The soft light spilling through the lace curtains, the faint smell of coffee still clinging to the air, the hum of the fridge in the background, but none of it felt the same. The space had been shifted somehow. A piece of it had been taken. The lake outside was as steady as ever. Its surface shimmered with a mid-afternoon brightness, the kind that made you squint if you stared too long. A pair of swans floated near the far reeds, their movements slow, deliberate, almost regal. The smell of sun-warmed wood from the dock drifted up toward the porch, mixing with the earthy scent of damp soil. All the sensory markers of peace were there, but it felt hollow now. Like a stage set for a play I didn't want to be in anymore. When the cops had been here, they hadn't been hostile. They'd been clinical, efficient. They'd inspected the garage door as if trying to find some hidden flaw, some smudge or irregularity that might justify the call. And while they hadn't found anything, their presence alone had been enough to create an image in the neighborhood's mind. And that was the part Karen knew would stick. A patrol car in front of someone's home was enough to start whispers. It didn't matter that nothing came of it, that no ticket was written, that there was no crime to speak of. In a community this small, perception was everything. And now my home had been placed in that unspoken category. The house that had the cops come by. I could almost feel her satisfaction from across the neighborhood. Karen didn't have to be standing there for me to know she'd seen it. She'd probably watched from her window or from behind some hedge, taking in every detail like a hunter watching prey. The satisfaction for her wasn't in the result, was in the disruption, the proof that she could set things in motion with a single phone call. For the rest of the afternoon, I moved through the motions of my day without really thinking. I swept the porch, rinsed the coffee mugs, watered the flowers. My body carried out the tasks automatically, but my mind was elsewhere. Circling the same thought over and over, she'd crossed a line. It wasn't the first time she'd pulled something like this, but it was the first time she'd brought in outside authority. That changed things. She'd taken a part of my home, the place I'd worked to keep peaceful, and turned it into a prop for her own theater. The more I thought about it, the more something cold and deliberate began to take root in me. I wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed confrontation. I wasn't quick to anger, bived in balance. If someone tilted the scales in their favor through spite or manipulation, then the weight had to be evened out. Not through shouting or aggression, that was Karen's way. No, I preferred something quieter, something that would sit with her. The way her actions were now sitting with me. Late in the day, the wind shifted, carrying a cooler air in from across the lake. The surface rippled, catching the fading light, and the smell of rain mixed faintly with the pine. The change in the weather matched the change in my own thoughts, clear skies giving way to something heavier, something ready to break. As evening approached, the cottages along the shore began to light up one by one. Golden squares of lamplight flickered on, reflecting in the water. A few boats returned to their docks, their small motors humming softly as they cut across the fading light. Somewhere far down the shoreline, someone started a campfire, the faint trail of wood smoke curling into the cooling air. I sat outside and let the darkness creep in, thinking about the events of the day. The humiliation Karen had tried to engineer wasn't just a momentary inconvenience, was an attack on the way I lived. She'd taken a piece of my peace and tried to replace it with suspicion. The thing about living by the lake is that you learn to read changes in the water. Small ripples can tell you when a storm is coming, even before the clouds appear. And just like with the lake, I could feel the storm inside me beginning to gather. This wasn't going to fade with time. I let it go. She'd see it as a green light to do worse. The revenge I was beginning to shape in my mind wasn't about shouting her down or starting a war. It was about balance. It's about taking the thing she'd weaponized public perception and turning it right back on her by nightfall. The last of the light had bled from the sky, leaving only the deep blue reflection of the moon on the water. The air had cooled enough to carry the sound of the small waves against the dock up to the porch. Somewhere out in the darkness, a fish leaped, the splash echoing like a punctuation mark on the day. Karen had made her move. She brought the weight of authority to my doorstep over something as harmless as a garage door. She'd created a spectacle for the neighborhood, planting seeds of doubt about me in the minds of people. I'd lived alongside peacefully for years, but she'd forgotten something important. Small communities remember things, but they also remember people. And once an image takes root, it's hard to erase. That was where my advantage would be. I stayed outside until the air turned sharp with cold, the water lapping softly against the shore. My mind was clear now. The earlier frustration distilled into something sharper, more focused. I didn't know the exact shape my response would take yet, but I knew it would come. And when it did, it would be just as visible as that patrol car had been in my driveway, only this time the eyes of the neighborhood wouldn't be on me. They'd be on Karen. Once you make peace with the fact that someone's crossed a line, the mind has a strange way of settling into a calm, deliberate rhythm. That night, after the moon had climbed high enough to paint the lake in silver light, I sat on the porch and let the water do its work. The gentle slap of waves against the dock, the faint rustle of reeds in the breeze, they cleared my head until all that remained was the seed of an idea. It was bold, unmistakable, and once it was done, there would be no taking it back. But that was the point. Karen had tried to use perception against me, turning something plain and harmless into something suspicious in the eyes of the neighborhood. So I decided to make it so that whenever anyone in this community looked at my garage door, they wouldn't see suspicion. They'd see her. The idea came together in fragments at first. I pictured her expression, the same self-satisfied tilt of the chin she wore when she was about to pass judgment on someone else's life. I imagined the way her eyes narrowed, not from the sun, but from the sheer effort of disapproval. And I thought about how ridiculous that look would seem if it were 20 feet wide and staring out at the street for everyone to see. The more I turned it over in my mind, the more it felt right. Not violent, not destructive, just truthful. An unfiltered, larger-than-life reflection of what she'd shown me all along. The next morning broke bright and clear. Mist still clung low to the water, but the sun was already beginning to burn, through turning it into golden ribbons that curled up into the cool air. The smell of lake water mixed with the faint sweetness of blooming lilacs from somewhere down the road. It was the kind of morning that would have tempted me to take the boat out early any other day, but not this one. This day had a different purpose. I started by clearing out the garage, pulling my tools into the driveway and sweeping the concrete floor until it was clean. The empty space echoed slightly, the sound of the broom's bristles scratching against the surface ringing out in the quiet. On the workbench, I lined up the supplies I'd gathered: primers, paints, brushes in every size, a roller for the large sections, and a reference image I'd quietly pulled from the neighborhood's community newsletter. Karen had submitted a photo of herself for some Meet Your Neighbors column last summer. It wasn't high resolution, but it had all the details I needed. I spent the morning sketching the outline in light charcoal. The lines were faint at first, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. But slowly, the shape began to emerge: the high curve of her hair, the sharp set of her jaw, the unmistakable squint of her eyes. I worked with care, making sure the proportions were exact. This wasn't a caricature. This was realism in all its unflattering glory. The lake stayed quiet that morning, as if holding its breath. Occasionally, a soft breeze would sweep across the yard, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and the distant hum of a motorboat. But the steady rhythm of my work drowned out everything else. I could feel the hours passing in the slow crawl of sunlight across the driveway by midday. The sketch was complete, and I stepped back to take it in. Even without color, it was unmistakable. Her likeness loomed across the entire surface of the garage door, staring out at the street with that same air of judgment she wore like armor. That was when I began to paint. The first strokes went on fast, broad swaths of background color to set the stage. Then came the details. I layered in the tones of her skin, the shadows that deepened the lines around her mouth, the particular shade of her hair that caught the light just enough to reveal every strand. I worked with precision, not rushing, letting the image take shape naturally. Each stroke felt like another step toward balancing the scales. The sun climbed high, and the air warmed enough to carry the scent of fresh paint down the road. Every so often, I'd hear the distant crunch of tires on Gravola neighbor heading into town or returning from a morning errand. I didn't look up, but I knew they'd seen the work in progress. By late afternoon, the painting was nearly complete. Her eyes, meticulously shaded to capture that exact look of suspicion, were the last thing I worked on. It was strange, almost meditative, to paint the very gaze that had been turned on me so many times before. Only now, it was frozen in place, staring not at me, but at every single person who passed by. When I finally put the brush down, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The light turned the lake into a sheet of molten gold, and the painting seemed to catch some of that glow. It was bold, impossible to ignore, and most importantly, undeniable. Anyone who saw it would know exactly who it was. I cleaned up my tools. In the fading light, rinsing brushes in the bucket and stacking paints back onto the workbench. The smell of turpentine lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of water and the faint smoke of someone's evening fire starting up down the shore. As twilight settled in, I sat back in a lawn chair across the driveway and looked at my work. It didn't feel like vandalism or cruelty, felt like truth laid bare for everyone to see. The garage door had gone from being a blank canvas for her accusations to a literal canvas that told its own story. I imagined the first time she'd see it, the way her steps would falter when she rounded the bend, how her eyes would widen just slightly before she caught herself, how she'd try to cover the reaction with a sharp comment, even as the color rose in her cheeks. And I imagined the way the rest of the neighborhood would react, some with stifled laughter, others with open amusement, and maybe a few with quiet satisfaction. The lake had returned to its evening calm, the water dark and still except for the faint ripples where the wind touched it. Stars began to prick through the deepening blue above, their reflections winking in the water. Somewhere in the distance, a lone frog croaked. It felt balanced now. Not because the painting erased what she'd done, not didn't, but because it shifted the weight back where it belonged. Oh, she had tried to make me a public spectacle. She was the one on display. And the best part, I didn't have to say a single word. The morning after the paint dried, the lake was still as a sheet of glass. And the gulls were already gossiping in the air like they'd been handed front row tickets to a scandal. Sunlight spilled over the horizon, the kind that makes the water look like molten gold. I stood at the end of my driveway, coffee in hand, looking at my garage door like it was the crown jewel of the neighborhood. And in a way, it was just not for the reasons Karen had hoped for. There she was. Karen's face, larger than life, sprawled across my garage door in painstaking, photorealistic detail. Every sharp line, every raised eyebrow, every disapproving squint captured with precision. The artist had gone beyond a simple likeness. This was Karen in her purest form. Pursed lips like she'd just smelled something rotten. Eyes narrowed as if trying to vaporize joy out of existence. It was a portrait, but it was also a warning. The best part, the backdrop. I'd had her face painted as if emerging from a shadowy alley, peeking through blinds, holding a phone to her ear like she was mid-call to the police. On the handset, in big, bold letters, the numbers 911 gleamed. The lakeside sunset was behind her, painted exactly like the one she'd ruined for me the night she called the cops. By the time I'd taken my first sip of coffee, the show had already begun. Neighbors slowed their morning walks to a crawl, some pretending to tie their shoes just to linger. Phones came out, click, 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 and the images spread faster than the lake breeze. A few tried to be discreet, but the snickers were impossible to hide. I didn't need to check the local Facebook group to know the post was already going viral. From my spot at the driveway, I could see her curtains twitching. She was in there, no doubt choking on her morning tea, probably debating whether to storm out or crawl under her bed. But she didn't come outside. Not yet. She'd have to pass the wall of eyes, both real and painted. That now guarded my property. The artist had even included a fine detail only the keen-eyed would notice. Tiny, ghostly outlines of a police badge in the shadows near her face. Was subtle, but anyone who knew the story would understand. The message was crystal clear. Karen, the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, immortalized in her most infamous act. The HOA board was the first to react, of course. Around noon, a white SUV with the HOA logo rolled up, the kind of vehicle they drove around like it was a patrol car. The president stepped out, clipboard in hand, trying to look authoritative, but I could see his eyes dart from the mural to the growing crowd of onlookers. He didn't even make it halfway up the driveway before a neighbor called out from across the street, "Hey, that's art. Leave it alone." Laughter rippled through the small gathering. The president cleared his throat, muttered something about community standards, then retreated to his SUV without a word. I imagine he realized quickly that any attempt to order its removal would look like the HOA was defending Karen's stunt. And with the amount of community members taking photos, the last thing they wanted was more attention. By the late afternoon, the lake had become a stage. Boats slowed as they passed by my property, people standing up for a better look. Kids giggled as their parents whispered explanations. Even the old-timers who normally avoided HOA drama came by with sly grins and nods of approval, and then finally, she emerged. Karen stepped onto her porch like someone walking into a courtroom. Her hair was pulled back tight, her lips pressed into a razor-thin line. She wore oversized sunglasses, probably hoping to hide her eyes, but it just made her look like the mural leerily so. She stood there for a good 10 seconds, glaring at my garage door from across her lawn before retreating back inside without saying a word. No yelling, no finger-pointing, no threat of legal action. Just a silent retreat. It was the most satisfying thing I'd ever witnessed. The days that followed were a blur of subtle victories. People stopped me at the grocery store to say they'd driven out of their way just to see it. A local painter reached out to ask if they could feature it in an Art in Public Spaces showcase. Even a regional news station sent a crew filming a segment about small-town art as protest. The camera lingered on the mural as the reporter explained the neighborly dispute that had sparked it, careful not to name Karen directly. But everyone watching knew. The beauty of it was that the revenge wasn't just about embarrassing hurt, was permanent. Every time Karen looked out her window, she'd see herself, forever mid-complaint, forever holding that phone, weighty like. Turning the mirror she'd tried to hold up to me right back in her direction. Only bigger, louder, and impossible to ignore. And I didn't have to lift a finger beyond commissioning the work. No shouting matches, no threats, no lawsuits, just paint on a door, telling the story for me. Over and over, by the end of the week, the mural had become a sort of landmark. Locals refer to my property as the Karen Garage, and boat tours passing through the lake even pointed it out to visitors. I'd catch strangers laughing on the water, and every time I heard it, it felt like justice had been served in the most poetic way possible. Karen, of course, stopped hosting her little front porch gossip sessions. She rarely came outside during daylight anymore, and when she did, she avoided eye contact with everyone. It was like watching a storm cloud finally realize it couldn't control the weather as the summer went on. The mural stayed vibrant under the sun. The lake's breeze carried the scent of water lilies and fresh-cut grass, and my garage stood proudly in the middle of it, all proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or violent. Sometimes it's a picture so vivid that it leaves. No room for her version of the story, and in a small lakeside town where word travels faster than wind. That picture would hang in people's memories far longer than it would on my garage door.